Okay. Let's see how this works. Oh, there we go. I can now see myself on the YouTube as well as on the Steam here. Okay, the delay is freaking me out. We are good.
We'll see it in the comments as well.
Show comments on stage. How's that work? Oh yeah, no, we're not going to do that till later. Can you see the comments in the right-hand side of the studio?
I can, yeah.
Okay, good.
It'll be double to have him in stage. Madeline had that. And,
wonderful.
I saw him double and delayed, which was... But it also showed which comments did not make it to YouTube.
Right, so I could... Ah, no, we don't want that. Hello, Amber.
Hello.
Oh. I'm so close. I got 499 subscribers without a video done.
This is going to be the day.
This is going to be the day. 500 subscribers.
Maybe 1,000.
If there are 500 people in this stream, I would be quite lucky.
And they all decide to subscribe.
They will decide to like, subscribe, and comment, and that is where the fear comes.
Oh, yeah.
We're live on.
Here we go.
Yay, 500.
No way. Wow, 500 subscribers. Thank you so much, Amber. You are now a #1 top fan. Oh. I don't know. We may want to give it a bit until people jump over from the previous stream. Woohoo! Oh yeah, right. I need...
Bib did not set up the redirect.
Bib's posted a link now. I don't think Bib had auto redirect set up for any of his streams.
I did set that redirects could happen. I did change that in my YouTube settings. So.
Hi, Nemo. Hi, Bavilia.
Hey, Bavilia.
Jonathan!
I did end up going to sleep after you and Madeline called me out.
Hi, Maddie. Hi, Magpie.
Brilliant.
The redirect did happen when they closed the stream. Yeah.
I did not just wake up, Madeline. I woke up 5 hours ago.
Do you know, I was so surprised to see Maddie in World Building Pastor's video, because I thought I was getting up early to watch that. Was it at 8? No, it was at 10, I think. And Maddie was awake. I was like, how?
Well, Madeline, I'm making sure to stay properly hydrated with coffee. All right, how many people do we have? 43 people watching the stream. DiDee and Jake, are you ready?
I am.
Always.
All right, we are hot to go. Hello, everyone. I'm Will, the world builder formerly known as Ross, and welcome to Lands Unknown. Today, as a part of the World Building Festival, I'm joined by DiDee and Jake from Let's Have a Bouba to explore how to make religions more immersive in your world building project. In this stream, we're going to provide a functional approach to flesh out your constructed religions by looking at how religion intersects with different aspects of society, how religion lives in the world and takes up space, and how challenging your idea of what a religion is can help expand what's possible in your world building. First, I'm going to turn it over to DiDee to talk about making and modeling religion.
Thank you so much, Will. I'm DiDee, and for the last decade, I've been teaching religious education in secondary education. This year, I teach 17-year-olds to critically reflect on big questions, on life's questions, and arrive at their own answers. And for this, religion is a very important inspiration. We see that religion has been pondering many of the themes that my students also ponder about, and we see what all this pondering has brought us so far. Up to last year, I was also teaching at college level, the new RE teachers and theology students. And in my free time, I'm writing a fantasy series spanning about 10,000 years, where the development and decline of religion is a very important aspect. And yes, that is a meow. My cat Pantera is with me, supporting me through all this. Religion is a difficult subject because it carries strong emotions, and it's also very hard to define. It's complex and complicated. And I studied religious studies, and the discipline of religious studies has tried to find a definition for religion for about 125 years. And all this has not resulted into something that we can all agree is good. In whatever way you try to define religion, there's also always something that slides through the cracks. Either something that you want to include in your definition escapes the definition, Buddhism, I'm looking at you there, or there's stuff that you don't think is religion, but really fits the definition. And a good example there is sports fans that behave very religious if you look at it in certain ways. Next to that, there's a problem that the terminology that we use in the field is, or was, still is, mostly pretty biased to the modern Western world. And the further we travel away from the modern Western world, the less our terminology fits. And this is an aspect that Jake will zoom in on in their part of the stream. I would argue that all this is a blessing for world building because it gives us a field that is so broad that it's very hard to come up with something so wild that it doesn't fit the bill of religion anymore. It's also a challenge, and because of that, I define a heuristic, purpose-oriented model to create a religion. We're not building a religion for religion's sake. We're building a religion in a constructed culture that is or is not the basis for a story, and that gives us some leeway to leave some things undefined. You can always add more granularity and detail. And in the end, and that's a part of the last two aspects of this stream, we're going to make a mess out of things, and that's ultimately trying to make it all feel real and lived. This is the build-up of this section of this stream. We'll start with the red bits. There's two terms that I need to explain for this all to make sense. We're going to spend a very small amount of time on this. Then we go to the orange bit, where we are going to see where you can start when you're constructing a religion, and what the result of that is. And then we go to the green part, which is the model that I'm discussing. And finally, we're going to the blue part, which is the paint splattering. Right. My approach to this is a heuristic model, which is purposefully pragmatic, imperfect, and incomplete. It's a simplification of reality, so that we have at least a chance of coming to a conclusion. It's not the real thing, but if we're going to use it for either a world building project or a story, it doesn't have to be the real thing. It just has to seem like it is. And a heuristic model is perfect for that. So we're not going to create something fully formed. We're going to use rules of thumb. In the first part, the green part, we're going to see that it is all clean and neat, and that's why the blue part, the splattering of paint and the blurring of lines, is going to be very, very important. There's one methodological aspect that I want to discuss. That's the hermeneutic circle, which is a theological method which is used to interpret difficult and many-layered texts. You're trying to get as close as you can, knowing that you'll never get there, to the mind of the author of the text. What did they mean? You're going to try and irk closer and closer. And one method for that is what's called the hermeneutic circle, which is a methodological device where you accept that looking at a detail informs your view about the whole. And if you look at the whole with these new eyes, you'll look at the details differently. And suppose you find a bracelet somewhere in the sand, and you look at it and you recognize it as a golden bracelet, and then you look at a detail of the bracelet, one of the sides of the bracelet, and you'll notice that there's some scratch marks in there, and you look closer and you see that they are probably deliberate. And then you zoom out to the bracelet again, and then you see that the entire bracelet is covered by these scratch marks. And then you zoom in at the other side of the bracelet, and you notice that the scratch marks at the other side of the bracelet are pointed the other way. And then with that knowledge, you look at the bracelet again, and you may or may not notice that the scratch marks are changing from the one side to the other. And that's to illustrate that if you look at a detail of something, and you go back with that, what you learned there, looking at the whole, that your view of the whole changed. And with that changed view, you can look at the details with different eyes again. And the problem is that this actually never stops. So there's a certain point that you just have to pull the plug and say, this is enough, because, and this is a world building problem. If you don't, you'll never stop, and you'll never get somewhere. And also this, what you see here in the hermeneutic model is the reason that we tend to reread sacred texts, because you read a detail in the text and you with the knowledge that it gives you. You look at the entirety of the text differently, and then you read another text with that knowledge. Let's go on. I'm excited for this part. So when you create a religion, an important question is, where do you start? And it's a decision you can make, and the decision matters, but you can decide to start anywhere. If we look at our world, we don't know when our ancestors became spiritually aware. I've tried to show this at the bottom of this slide. You see a very rudimentary timeline of the evolution of our species, Homo sapiens. And we start maybe at 300,000 years ago. Depends a little on the source. Depends a little on the scholar where they place the boundary. So I made it to gradually get it scholar. But what is a fact is that when we became Homo sapiens, we shared our worlds with many other hominids. And if we look at different markers that we might associate with being spiritual, we see that these markers have been with our fellow hominids for a very long time. About 115,000 years ago, people started to decorate themselves with pigments and colored shells. And 70,000 years ago, we find funerary rites being performed on people that died. And the oldest cave art that we know of is 65,000 years ago in Spain. There might be even older ones in Africa. And all of this was not done by Homo sapiens. It was done by by fellow hominids. So there's a question popping up from there. Did Homo sapiens come up with all these things that they later started to do themselves independently? Did they sneak a peek at what the Neanderthals did, and did they started to copy them? Or, and this is wild and probably not true, but I'll mention it because you're allowed to dream when you're world building. Maybe it's an aspect from the last common ancestor, and they did all these things, and we don't have records of that. In real life, that's probably not true, but hey, you can build it in your world if you want to. What we do know is that the elements of spirituality, or what we think we do now, did come up in response to the needs of the time. Our ancestors lived pretty harsh lives in a surrounding that was not made for them, in the sense that maybe it was, but it didn't care if you perished or not. And either it gave you very big bounties, or it gave you nothing and your entire family died of hunger. And there was nothing they could do about that. So they tried to find some meaning in whatever they came across. And these needs are codified in spirituality and later in religion. And if you divide human history in several blocks, the needs of our hunter-gatherer ancestors are different from agricultural people or industrial times or postmodern needs. And if a religion was and is a response to needs that people have, if these needs change, religion changes. And this is something you can incorporate in your world building. So where do you start? Okay, can you go back one slide? Yes, perfect. Where do you start? It doesn't really matter. You can start in the postmodern part and just assume everything that happened before, or copy it from this world. That really works well. But if your world differs, the world that you're creating differs from ours, it might be interesting to go 1 or 2 steps back and start from there, and through the model that will be on the next slide and further, see how one element, one need influences the future. So let's go to the model. What we have here is based on the book of Ninian Smart, where he defined 7 dimensions of religion. And this is descriptive in the sense that we see that many religions have these elements in one way or another, and they're not always clear, they're not always as important, but they're usually there. And for this model, I flipped this around. So if you want to create a religion, it might be worthwhile to look at these 7 dimensions and think about how these dimensions function in your world. We're going to have a peek at all of them. And what I would love if one of these dimensions mentions something that you have dealt with in your com world. Suppose you made a ritual. You want to share that with us. Type it in the comments, and you might inspire other people to create their own thoughts and rituals. Right. The first dimension of the 7 is the practical and ritual dimension, and this deals with what people in a religion do. This includes rites and rituals, and these are usually, and I'm going to point forward to another dimension here, these usually reenact certain myths from a culture or religion. And in the sense that the Christian rite of baptism is, at least the Catholic, well, many of them, are reenactments of the baptism of Jesus of Nazareth in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. And what happens is that one officiant does symbolically redo this, what happened to Jesus, in the hopes of getting somewhat of the same results. Yes, let's go to the next. I often tell my students, as often as I can, that many of the terminologies that we use when talking about religion are attempts to code the emotions that people have. This is how important emotions are, and religions try to make us understand emotions, try to guide emotions to places where they work in a broader society. But also it tries to deal with religious experiences. And religious experiences are a thing that Rudolf Otto wrote about over 100 years ago. And he defined them as being at the same time mysterious, majestic, and frightening. And you can imagine that if a person has an experience like that, that he has to make sense of that. And religions try to guide these experiences to somewhere. Then we go to the stories, and stories are one of the more popular aspects of religions. And some religions, these stories are one of the few things that remain. Stories can be about the god, they can be about important people, they can be creation stories, they can be cosmological stories about how the world came to be. Remember that stories are also attempts to convey emotion and deal with trying to describe the human condition to other humans. And these stories underpin many of the other dimensions, or are examples of them in a story. Stories aren't static though, they change, and this is a very interesting part where you can, if you defined a longer term history of your common world, you can pick a historical fact, turn that into a legend, let that legend go into a myth, and maybe even further in an archetype if you want. And you can even let go of what happened and just invent a myth or invent a legend that turned into a myth. You don't have to tie it neatly to the to what happened. You can play around with this, and this is a perfect part where you can plug in the rest of your world building to your religion and make it feel lived and as one. We're not sure if the Great Flood happened, but it makes a hell of a story. And notice that this is a story that is especially interesting and fitting in places that are prone to flooding. Let's go to the doctrinal and philosophical dimension of religion. This is neatly tied to those stories, and these stories can tell something about how people think that the world works. So from a story, you can pick out how people think that the world works, or the other way around, and the way that the world works codified into a story. Cosmology fits here, but also theological and philosophical beliefs of the people about how they look at the world. And this goes neatly into ethical and legal dimension, because it doesn't necessarily stay with a doctrine. The doctrine can become more pressing and turn into a rule. There's a power essence in religion, and people dictating how other people should live their lives. How people should deal with each other, how people should deal with the institution, if there is one, how they should deal with the environment, how they should deal with the divine. This and what the previous dimension is also where values live, and shared values can be a very strong base for unity among people. Or if you divide people on a value base, you have a very interesting story of conflict that you can tell, which you can fit into your religion, which is a good a good point to tie your religion back into your world to make it feel more lived even. Let's finally go to the people of a religion. What we usually have is books and stories and ideas and philosophies. But what we often forget in world building religions is that there's also people that live this religion. This is something that Will is going to talk about much more in depth than I will. But to understand a religion, you need to know how it works among the people. And then there is a big difference between how the elite functions, sees a religion, and how people in the daily lives deal with it, and how one tries to influence the other. And finally, the last dimension is the stuff. This is the place where you can give your religion a face. And also this is something where I will tie into how do the temples look? How do the statues look? What stuff do people use? Prayer beads, for instance, are a very interesting, quite ubiquitous part of religion. Also, art lives here, but you can also go the other way around. There's certain real-world examples of religions that try to ban depiction at all, and which gives a very interesting theme and gives you very interesting ramifications on how their places of worship might look, how their cities might look. So back to the fact that religion is messy. You'll want to make yours a bit of a mess too. And what you'll notice is if you start to think about this, you'll see that some of the things that you come up with don't neatly fit into one dimension or the other. And that's actually a blessing. And if they fit too neatly, then you need to blur some lines, then you spatter some paint, create some artifacts of olden times, old gods that have new meaning, like might have happened to the Norse god Tyr. Maybe old needs that were fulfilled in a ritual have remained even if the need is not there. I think about the Christmas tree, for example, which is a part of a much older habit that people had, which somehow ended up in our most of our homes at the end of the year. Will and Jake are going to help us make a mess of things, which I really appreciate. And there's a little room for questions for this segment. We agreed on 5 minutes, and there'll be a longer segment for questions at the end of the stream. If we have the time for that, probably we will.
Yeah. And while folks are thinking up their questions, I wanted to go back to some of the prompts from the questions that you gave. Can I do this? Oh, there we go. Bavia said, a regular ritual in one of my con religions is a daily communal meal and prayer, ritually sharing the bounty of the gods, which was granted to their chosen people long ago before giving thanks for it. So,
yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we also had one about magical music.
Oh.
Where Jonathan has magical music in the world building setting, and they have some in-universe disagreement over exactly how music translates to magic and the ritual aspect.
I love that.
Of it. Yes,
I love that. Yeah, I have a deity of justice, and people keep fighting about if justice can change over time or if it's something absolute and never changing. Yeah.
We've also got Tabby. A con culture gathers at the place of the last message from their creators. They self-flagellate, acknowledging each other's failures over the last year and sharing blame for their god's silence.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. That reminds me of Dragon Age, one of the earlier. I think that what the religion in there of the Maker was really well done. And there was something, it's ages since I last played it, but I remember there was something like the Maker left, and only if in all corners of the world his song was sung, then he would come back. And so their temples were always filled with chanting. This reminds me of this a little. Perfect.
And I think this does also lean a bit forward into the next part as well, where we're going to be talking about the role of space and landscape at different sites.
Yes.
And how how religion moves people. But we do have a question from Nemo here.
Mm-hmm.
In the last slide, you mentioned bottom-up versus top-down approach in building religion. The question really would be how to make those two methods coherent, given both deal with quite different things.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if they need to be coherent. If you're going to make a mess out of things, just let them collide, let them stand next to each other, and let them grab each other by the horns.
And I'm going to be talking about the difference between elite and folk religion as well, and they often are quite distinct.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, we have another one here. What would be the most important thing to focus on to make your religion sound serious, but not too cliche or over the top? Like, I often find myself making everyone look like over the top fanatics.
two things. Almost, well, I shouldn't say this online. I think there's many people that don't exactly live their lives as the book prescribes. And a religion can be quite neatly put down in a tome. But once you look at how actual people live their lives that are dealing with that religion, you get quite a different view. And what might also work, I think, is really tying into the needs of the people, because you get sort of a natural fit with the environment and the rest of your home world. And the religion pops up naturally from whatever else you have defined in your project. I think if you use those two next to each other, then you'll have it wouldn't be everything you need, but it's a good start, I think.
I think we've got time for one more. Here we have our knight Petrichor. My lunar deity gave one of her eyes to the people of the world so they could always see the love of gods and the beauty in the world. So her followers wear a veil over their dominant eye.
Oh, nice.
Very cool.
And I wonder if everybody does that, or only in public, or only if the priests look.
Some more spatialization questions. I think we've reached our 5 minutes for questions on this section. Yes, we did, Jonathan.
You can watch it back.
Yeah. This will be available on my channel afterwards, so you'll be able to go back to it. All right, now we're going to head to the second part of this presentation, where we're going to talk about placing your religion in the world and taking the different dimensions that DiDee presented and show you how they can really take up space. So for myself, I'm a secular person living in a broadly secular and individualistic society. And it can sometimes be taken for granted that religion only happens in certain places that are specially, there for it, like in a church or a temple, like a gurdwara, or in the home, or that religion is something that is private and personal rather than something that is communal and public that everyone shares. For most of the world and throughout history, religion has been an ever-present part of life that shapes people's place in the world. And to frame that, I'm going to talk about religion having mass, volume, and motion. And what I mean by religion having mass, it's that it is a weight that shapes people's relationships and their behaviors. People carry religion with them, and it informs how they engage with other people. Religion also has volume. Religious considerations permeate societies, and this is especially important in world-building cultures that aren't as individualistic as contemporary urban life for me is, because oftentimes religion is part of the glue that can hold a community together. It doesn't just stop at the door to the temple or around the altar in the home. It's something that's going to be informing your daily communications with people. And finally, religion has emotion. Religious traditions move across space and over time. Religious practices that begin in one place often move with people and ideas and trade to other places. Religion also pushes and pulls through people throughout their day. Someone can be called multiple times to go into certain spaces in order to engage in devotion or veneration or prayer. And I think that this altar in a Malaysian Chinese home depicting the Pure Land sages is a good example of this. It's showing how religion can exist in the home, have a particular site in the home where a devotional practice can be engaged in. And, the Chinese diaspora in Malaysia has brought certain ideas with them when they moved. And those have encountered Malaysian ideas and been negotiated and changed over time. And while religion can exist in the home, it also exists in public life, as well as in particular devotional and sacred sites. But what makes sacred sites, religious sites, special? Often in these in geographies of religion, we focus on talking about sacred spaces. And as Didi mentions, not just religious sites can be considered sacred. I mean, you could consider a sports stadium a sacred site of sports fans. There are also places you could consider sacred sites for nations. There are a lot of religious studies that talk about nationalism as a kind of civic religion. But what makes a place sacred? One thing we can do is think about the design. In some religions, there are particular design philosophies, such as sacred geometries, and creating buildings designed to those specifications make them sacred. Or if you want to build a temple, you better build them to these design specifications, or they won't be considered sacred sites. Housing certain objects can also make a site sacred. These can be relics, so remnants of previously important people in the religion. In Christianity, famously, you've got saints as well as martyrs, whose bodies are taken as relics and housed in very ornate reliquaries, though not always. Sacred sites can be also associated with important people, or they can house important symbols for the religion. Just having a religious symbol inside of a space can make it a sacred space. Many religions, both historic and contemporary religions, see their deities or spirits as existing in the world and interacting with the world through certain objects, whether those objects are in the natural environment, or things like rocks, as well as statues. Statues depicting certain deities or spirits could be seen as their conduits into the world, and therefore the buildings that house those objects are seen as the homes of those spirit deities. As I hinted at before, sacred spaces could be associated with different historic events or historic people that are important in the religion. Something significant could have happened in a space, and that is why it is a sacred space. They can also be associated with different myths. They can be associated with different stories and biblical texts and narratives, but they can also be seen as places where the divine peeks through into the worlds. I believe that's hierophany. And these things can also intersect. There are certain, churches, for example, that are houses of worship and ritual practice. People go there to engage in worship. Churches in the Christian tradition are often seen as the house of God. They can also be the site of an important relic, and they can be the site where something important historically happened. So you can have these layers of sacredity that accrete on top of one another that make these places important. And what you have as well is when multiple religions or different traditions of religion branch off from each other, you can have competing claims to different sites, especially as different religions change them over time and what's important for them. Finally, as we see in the picture here, this is Shinboku. It's a kind of sacred tree in Shinto, or the folk religion of Japan. And sacred trees and sacred groves are actually very common sites in the natural environment that are venerated around the world. We also have other kinds of geographical features that are venerated or respected, that include rivers, mountains, and caves. And while certain sites may be venerated, religions can also produce their own landscapes and make things become sacred. Or a religion can shape the way that a landscape looks and how it's experienced. One of the ways that I think is the most obvious is architecture. And I think this is something that a lot of world builders are very aware of. And what's important about architecture is this is where religions literally take up space in a community, especially if they have a sort of central temple or other place of worship. There are also different branches of religions, and they all have their distinct artistic traditions. DiDee hinted at this earlier, where there are some religious traditions that do not depict any living beings or important people. This is true of some traditions of Islam that hold that depicting living things, especially the prophets, is forbidden, but others that is not the case. There are traditions of Islam that have produced portraits and images of the Prophet Muhammad, for example. Instead, some of these religious traditions have used calligraphy and geometric designs throughout their architecture. This image here is from the Alhambra, which is in Granada, Spain, built before the Reconquista. And so thinking about the unique motifs and aesthetic choices that these religions make within their broader doctrinal frameworks, as well as their myths and their narratives, can highlight the differences as your project looks from one space to another. And thinking about the spatialization of religion in cities in the landscape, there can also be religious enclaves, which are settlements or neighborhoods that are homes to people who practice different religion than the surrounding groups. Part of having religious enclaves can include degrees of untouchability. A variety of cultures incorporate untouchability into their religions, or it existed in the culture and the religion adopted it, where there are certain strata of people in society who are considered to be spiritually unclean or less clean than the people around them. This can either be something inherent to them as a group of people, or it can be because of their occupation, where they engage in various taboo or profane acts. Historically, we can consider things like dealing with blood, for example, people who butchered animals, which is necessary for many societies, but it's not necessarily the cleanest thing to do. I worked as a butcher for a period of time. Other things include tanning, which is necessary, but it is a horrible smelly process that often demands working with ammonia. Sometimes that's gathered from urine. And there may be people who are seen as less spiritually clean because they deal with death more broadly. People who deal with pestilence, collecting bodies, burying bodies, they may be seen as spiritually unclean. And where they live may actually be legislated. Oftentimes, sacred authorities try to impose themselves on secular landscapes, or secular leaders may take sacred doctrines and use them to kind of legitimize and enforce their power. We can think about how people are forced to live in specific areas, or how they can be expelled from places entirely, like how Muslims and Jewish people were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula during the Spanish Inquisition. Carrying on this conversation of governance in religion, we can talk about the ways that authorities practice religion. A lot of what we know about religious practices from the past are focused on elite or state religion. We can think about the Mexica or the Aztec, the Triple Alliance. A lot of what we know about their religious practices, particularly the sacrifices and these sorts of things, is the elite religion. Like, we don't know particularly much about people were doing in their day-to-day lives, in the Triple Alliance. Like, what kind of religious practices were they engaging with? But religions from the past who have, particularly hierarchical polities like states, may have an elite or state religion that they impose on the populace. And they may do this through an official orthodoxy. And orthodoxy means believing the right thing, or orthopraxy, which means doing the right thing, like practicing religion in the right way. And historically, orthopraxy has been much more important for religions and for communities, because their daily lives were shaped around what they did within their community. And this is part of the glue that held the community together. Everyone had the same religious identity, and that came from engaging in the same ritual practices together. Contemporary religions, especially those with scriptures, have placed a lot more emphasis on orthodoxy. But you can see how this would be different in the past when you had smaller groups of people who were literate. They didn't particularly care, and it wasn't very important to the laity, the vast majority of people who are practicing the religion. But authorities may sponsor certain religious practices and establish an orthopraxy, thereby encouraging those practices. And certain festivals and celebrations may be tied to divine rituals that may be linked to the legitimation of the elites and keeping them in power. The elites in your con cultures may need certain rituals to happen in order for them to stay in power, especially if they're tied to, say, fertility and agriculture and the crops coming. If you fail to do the proper ritual and you get a bad crop that leads to famine, that may be a problem for the ruling elites. Quite a infamous example of this comes from Akhenaten, who is portrayed in this relief here as a sphinx. Akhenaten was a pharaoh in Egypt who decided to split from the state cult of Egypt, and instead of worshiping the usual pantheon, including Ra, decided to elevate Aten, which we can see here represented as the sun disk. Akhenaten famously created an entirely new capital city, as well as created a new art style to kind of distance this new state cult from the previous cult. And it was so unpopular that successive pharaohs tried to erase it from the landscape. There are a lot of inscriptions that appeared in other cities throughout Egypt that were vandalized or crossed out. The name was replaced. The face of the statues were often hammered off, just to kind of forget this whole attempt to change the cult. One reason why we know so much about it, though, and we have a lot of these images, is that the capital was actually abandoned. People just kind of left it in the middle of the desert, and we were able to stumble on it and find all of these artifacts to know about this very interesting point of Egyptian history. One more thing before moving on. Sorry. Religions could be on either side of this state-religion divide, and they may be in different places or throughout time. So, for example, when Christianity was getting started, particularly under the Romans, there were periods of persecution. Some were more intense than others. And then after Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, certain emperors started suppressing other religious practices. So we do have this ebb and flow where certain religions can be elevated to elite religion, depending on how things go. On the flip side of state and elite religion, we have embodied or lived religious experiences of people in their everyday life. Just to emphasize on the point that DiDi made, religions are organizations, they're institutions, they're doctrines, they're myths, but they're dead without the people who practice them. You need a body of people practicing the religion, and oftentimes that bit's kind of forgotten. So some of the ways that you can demonstrate the lived aspects of religion is through how it's embodied, like how people actually bring their religion with them into the world. As an example here, we have 4 Sikh men wearing dastars, which is their turbans, and wearing their beards in a particular style to practice kesh, which is one of the 5 kokars of Sikhi, or Syncretism, which are the outward symbols that certain Sikhs wear in order to demonstrate their religious practices. It's actually a religious practice for them to wear these outward signs. Another one of these is the kirpan, which is a kind of ceremonial knife that's Sikhs wear. So we can actually recognize different religious people or specific kinds of religious people. So, for example, around here, Christians don't tend to wear certain things besides crosses, but we still have nuns and monks and these kinds of things, and they wear distinct outfits to communicate their role within their own religious communities. You can also have different uniforms for different strata of religion to kind of demonstrate different religious groups, so that people can actually see them and identify them in space. Different groups within a religion can also have different expectations for what they wear, and these can fall along age and gender lines. But again, it can also depend on your rank within religious organizations or your role within the community. In addition to the clothing and ornamentation, religions can have different daily and weekly rhythms in space, and that can dictate how people use it. There are a lot of religions with daily rituals like prayers or devotions. In Sikhi, for example, just continuing with that, they have morning and evening devotions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have weekly worship, which is kind of well known, but each of those religions also have multiple prayers throughout the day. Christianity, for example, has multiple masses throughout the day that you can attend, even though, from my experience, most people don't. So people are pushed and pulled throughout the day, and there are ways of letting people know when it's time for them to engage in these different devotional practices. We think about church bells ringing for Mass, or the Adhan, which is the Muslim call for prayer. And filling your world with these kinds of details can help communicate how religion is a part of people's lives. How many books have you read, fantasy books have you read, where people are having a conversation and it has to stop because they have to go to a specific place to engage in veneration, right? It's the kind of thing that doesn't pop up too much, but it is something that can make religion feel more lived in the world. And part of religions living in the world is that they encounter one another all the time. So when religions come into contact in space with one another, there's a merging and negotiating of practices and ideas from these different religions. Here on the side, we have a silver dish from the Bactrian kingdom, which was a Hellenistic elite ruling over parts of Central Asia, primarily Afghanistan, in the 3rd century BCE. The Greeks and the Macedonians who came there brought the Hellenistic religious ideas with them, and then that formed Syncretism with Zoroastrian beliefs. So we can see Kybele and Helios, but then there's also a Zoroastrian altar, bringing these different religious elements together. And this can happen in a couple ways. So elites moving into a new region may adopt elements from the common people in order to try to legitimate their rule. On the other hand, though, elites may impose their religion through conquest. Elites may also adopt religion through diplomacy or trade. Quite famously, this is how Islam spread throughout the Indian Ocean. But then there's also competition. So a group of elites may want to increase their influence in certain segments of society. And if that segment of society is starting to adopt a new religion, those elites may decide to convert in order to legitimate themselves and gain more influence. And gain allies as well. But syncretism is also very popular and a part of folk religion. And this is especially true when religions are imposed on a group of people. They can take new religious practices that are put upon them and meld them with traditions they previously had. One of my favorite examples of this kind of popular folk syncretism is the Santa Muerte or La Flaca, the skinny lady who is a folk saint, primarily in Mexico, who's associated with pre-Christian indigenous practices. There are debates as to what specific pre-Christian practices that La Flaca is descended from, but there are several strands that connect Santa Muerte to previous practices. And these kinds of figures can blur the boundary between official orthodoxy and what the elites practice and the local religious practices. So if we're thinking about building top down and also bottom up, we can think of this kind of relationship where the elites and the official religion are doing a thing and the people are responding and sometimes doing their own thing. And when people are doing this and having their own religious practices, they're often informed by their personal relationships with their religion and their own spirituality. And I think we can find a lot of examples of this today with the variety of New Age practices that have been adopted by many people in Western society who, identify as Christians or Muslims, Jewish or secular, but also have a variety of New Age beliefs, incorporating syncretic practices like yoga, doing things like healing stones, practicing homeopathy, which has its own kind of religious system kind of baked into it that people kind of don't pay much attention to. And religious organizations have responded. There have been Christian organizations that have written tracts condemning people for using things like healing crystals because they say it's not part of Christian orthodoxy. And this really, as I said, blurs these boundaries, both in identity as well as in what we consider to be religion, right? If we think of religion as needing an official organization with certain books and people doing certain things, well, what happens when people's practices expand beyond that and incorporate other elements? So when you are placing religion in your constructed worlds, we have some questions that you can ask yourselves. Where is religion present in the society? Is it public? Is it private? Is it in the home? Are there certain religious sites in the community that people go to? Are there other shrines that exist outside the community? And what makes these places sacred or profane? Are there certain symbols that need to be in a space? Or is it just sacred because people worship there? The act of veneration makes the space a sacred space. And conversely, what can be done to pollute that space? And what kind of rituals and practices do people have to make the space sacred again? Thinking about like exorcisms and these kinds of things. I've been watching a lot of Korean films that have very cool exorcism sequences that include knives and sacrifices. They're very flashy, and looking at the varieties of different practices that people have to sanctify spaces can really help broaden your idea of what that looks like if you've only seen films like The Exorcist. How does religion appear in and shape the landscape, right? Do we see religion in the aesthetics that are chosen? Do we see religion in the way that people are organized, in the way that they are legislated to live in space? If your religion has different groups of people in it, whether they're castes or strata, are they organized in a certain way in the landscape? And from that, what differentiates elite religion from the rest of society? Are they practicing exclusive religious practices that are important for the continuation of the state? Are they just in their own private clubs having fancy feasts to certain deities that they don't let the poor people join in? There are a lot of different practices that the elites can engage in that are spatially distinct from the rest of society. But thinking of them, how do they live their religion in everyday life? What kinds of religious considerations are they making when they move through the world? And where do those ideas come from? Where do the current religious traditions, practices, and ideas come from? And how have they merged together? How have they been negotiated? Are there multiple different religious communities in sort of more cosmopolitan areas? And how do they interact with one another? And finally, what folk traditions and popular practices have different groups taken up? And how does this interact with historically previous ideas in the religion, but also with the elites. And how do the elites try to control this, if they try to control it? Because, popular and folk religious traditions, we call them that because they're not official, but really, today's folk traditions could be tomorrow's orthodoxy or orthopraxy. So thinking about it not as a clear, discrete thing, but as more nebulous and messy. All right, so yes, there was a kitty. We have 5 minutes for questions, and I'm going to look over some of the comments that we've had throughout this section. So if you have any questions or want any clarification for placing religion, I'd be happy to answer those over the next 5 minutes. What do we got here? The Greeks were often very pious, but they did not agree on theology. Yes, a lot of debates about theology and the role of different doctrines in Greek society. There's a lot of history of Jewish people being required to, I can show things, to live in specific places. That's true, particularly Eastern Central Europe. There was the Pale of Settlements where the Russian Empire forced Jewish people to live in particular areas. We can think about taboos, about the kind of work that Jewish people are allowed to do in England, which led to the association between Jewish people and banking. There was also prescriptions against Christians and taboos against what kind of banking they could do. And, in England, there were still periods of time where Jewish people were expelled. Oh, no, still kitty. What do we got? Yes, mixing religions is so fun. One of my favorite examples is the Haitian voodoo being amazingly diverse. Yes, and we can talk again about the movement of people, right? You have diaspora groups through the slave trade, which had a variety of different regional practices, and then that was being syncretized through the slave trade and taking peoples who had different languages and different religious traditions and forcing them together in these circumstances. Yeah. Thank you, Nemo. Oh, Des Viper. Hey, it's Des Viper. Has an example of live religion, follows of the Church of the White Sun from their con world. Wonderful. Don't wear dyed clothing as it pollutes sacred lights. Wonderful. And I would ask whether this means that they wear white clothing. So do they bleach their clothing, or do they just wear, if they're weaving something out of wool, do they just leave it beige or brown or, whatever color it is?
Or do they breed sheep with exclusively white wool?
There we go. That's another one. What do we got here? Oh, no, that is slides. I'm sorry about that. I thought it was going to let me what comment it was. In the modern area of culture of my con religion, Bavea says, more houses have shrines than kitchens due to the ubiquity of communal meals. Right, yeah, I remember that from the first half. Temples and street food combined with modern flats. That's actually something that's really interesting about cities in the ancient world. But I think Rome is a good example of this, is that most people didn't have kitchens in the cities. They didn't, because fuel was really expensive and space was a bit of a luxury. Also, these buildings were largely made of wood. And there's, the fire brigades in Rome were essentially a racket where you had to pay them in order to save your house. So just the ubiquity of having food stalls on the first floor that people could go in and eat from. That's a wonderful combination of religious practice with, urban life in the ancient world. Des Vipers following up on that. They wear raw clothing, but maybe posers wear bleached clothing. Excellent. Okay. Let's see if I can find something else. Yeah, McCain brings up the fact that sacrifice almost never appears in fantasy religion is really wild, considering how common it is as a religious trope, right? And sacrifice doesn't only have to include people or animals. Sacrifice regularly included, thinking about Mesopotamia, for example, in antiquity, because their statues were the deities themselves. The sacrifices would be meals. Like you would make a whole meal and present it to the deity, and it would be a sacrifice. And then you would close the curtains, and the priests would eat the meal. Because the rocks can't eat the meal, but it would be symbolically consumed by the attendants. So you're both, and many sacrifices to temples of animals would then be redistributed to the community. So you would sacrifice a sheep, or you'd sacrifice cows, and then everyone would have a party. What are we at? That is all the time we have for that. I'm mindful of our...
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get going, and if I'm spending too long on something, just move the slide forward, and I'll do my best to keep up. When I came into the project, I knew that I basically had come from a department of religious studies where most of what we did was spending time arguing about how religion didn't exist. And I thought I would kind of come with a kind of complementary sort of few models for how you can think about the position of religion and spirituality and spirits and people in the world from a few different perspectives. If we go to the next slide. So why bother going to the effort of coming up with a religion if you're just going to undo it? So part of what I'm asking you to consider is to break down your ideas before you go into it, so that when you come to making a religion, you have the widest palette possible to play with for what would fit the role of religion for what I imagine a lot of your authorship, like your readership, or whoever if you're making your culture for an audience, they will probably read quite a wide range of concepts as religion, because that's how it's presented to us. Many scholars are against the idea, even though we end up in religious studies departments, because that's where we fit. This issue of having to have everyone kind of come within this kind of area of or field means that there are a lot of people who have maybe one leg in one area and another leg in another. For example, what distinguishes philosophy from religion is quite a difficult question for a lot of people to answer. I want to open with a question, which is really, what is your Commonwealth's religion aiming to achieve? Because I don't want to sit here and say, oh, well, your religion shouldn't be like this and it shouldn't be like that, if what you're aiming to do when you make something that's very similar to Christianity or Greek pantheism is that you're trying to critique the idea of these things, or there is a theme that you're trying to pull out, because that would be completely opposite to what you're actually going for. But I want to kind of suggest that when you're thinking about the metaphysical, things that kind of transcend or are part of our world in new ways, you can expand your view from one particular worldview and think a bit more anthropologically about how religion works. If we go to the next slide. This is a picture of the, I think this was Dejima. So yeah, Dejima. So this was an artificial island built by the Japanese that was essentially one of the main ports where the Dutch were allowed to trade with Japan at. And a lot of what was traded for were books, So so-called Dutch learning became a big thing. And one of the things that arrived in these books was that they were read and then translated into Japanese, and anything that was considered harmful to the state was redacted. The Japanese had already had interactions with the Portuguese, and it hadn't gone very well. The Catholics had arrived, had introduced new kami, as they understood it, and then they killed them all, or at least most of them. So when the Dutch arrived with a reputation for being less religious, or at least they were not trying to convert them, the Japanese started to translate all of these documents. And one of the things that ends up coming is the idea of religion, which is a wasei kango. So it's where you have a Japanese, they have this word shukyo, which is a Japanese word made from Chinese characters, but they use these new Chinese words to translate Western concepts. So rather than having a loan word, you have shukyo, which then is introduced in China as tongjiao, in Korea as chungjo, and in Vietnam as tongzao, or zao. That was far too Chinese a pronunciation for that Vietnamese. Anyway, you can see in the picture you have these two Dutch boats, and religion also arrives around the world, often with the spread of a kind of Western model of the state. And Commodore Perry is a classic example of this, with guns pointed at the Japanese saying, give your people freedom of religion, and Japanese people being like, we're not entirely sure what you mean by that. And so I hope you understand, like, I'm not suggesting everyone's coming at this with guns pointed at their con cultures, but that's often how this has played out in history. If we move to the next slide. So a good way to, or not good is too judgmental, an interesting way to think about this is with models like this one from Josephson Storm, the citations at the end. And he talks about this negative trinity that is popularized in this modern period, which basically means that you have these three concepts with the popularization of secularism. That means that what's secular is defined as that which isn't religious, and religion is defined as that which isn't secular, and secularism hijacks the idea of science as well. So if it's not scientific, it's religious. And religion is this kind of protected category. And what secularism does by defining religion is that everything else can become superstition, which is that which isn't scientific knowledge, and isn't religion, which is this prescribed metaphysical knowledge or special knowledge. It's a kind of protected category. And superstitious beliefs are highly persecuted. So I've got this picture of a Korean shaman here, and they kind of went through all of these stages. So at one point, shamans in Korean culture would have been arbiters of being able to tell people how things really are and connect with the world in a way where they have all the knowledge, all the science, which is what science kind of means. And then they become more religious and they become part of a state setup. And then with the introduction of Buddhism and then Confucianism, they get relegated to superstition, basically, and remain relatively persecuted, although that's changing. If we go to the next one, the positive side of this can be framed with this idea of science, religion, and magic. And this isn't really a useful thing to think about magic in a common world, because usually magic in a common world has a specific power or something, whereas this is an anthropological idea of magic, which basically is a way of resisting the kind of prescribed models of science and religion. And I think it really fits well with this bottom-up approach about what can people do outside of these structures. So the topeng Bali is a kind of Balinese dance mask that possesses the dancers. And it's not something you would see in standard Hindu practice in India. It's not part of a kind of accepted scientific background, but it's a kind of way for them to dance in the world in a spirited way, which links us to the next bit. Animism is an idea that you'll hear a lot, particularly when you're talking about kind of early religions. And it originated in the 19th century and was basically a theory that was taken from reports of people who currently existed at the time, who were believed to represent how things were a very long time ago, much longer ago than is represented here. And they made this model of a kind of evolution of religion from animism into what they saw as more complex or more developed models. And because people realized that it was kind of dodgy in how it was being used, it fell out of favor. And then if we go to the next slide, we then have these like new anthropologists who are like, we've gone to the Amazon and they have this really cool stuff and we need a word to talk about it. And they say, we're going to use animism because people already know the word. So the real question that I wanted to ask here was, are you writing your culture as an analog to your own? I guess it's repeating it. Or if what I'm asking you to do in this section is try and put down your kind of lens that you're seeing the world through and try and genuinely believe that there are people who live their lives in ways that are quite hard for us to understand. If we move to the next section. So De Schola is another academic who's worked on this area, and he is often associated with this idea of new animism, and he creates this model, which is my second big model, or third if you consider the first two different anyway. I'm gonna like go really quickly through it much faster. Okay, next slide. So you have this chart, and it's correct this time because I fixed it. You have some areas with dissimilar interiorities, which is basically like how they see themselves as people and their perspective on the world. And then you also have this idea of physicality, which is kind of our bodies and nature and that sort of thing. So if we move to the next one, so the big idea, one of the big ideas is animism. So this is basically taken from these Amazonian cultures as a model, but you also see it in parts of Africa and in pockets around the world. So the essential idea is that all, like, maybe not everything, but you live in a world full of people with different kinds of bodies, different kinds of ways of existing, and we have basically the same souls, the same, to use a very Christian term, or the same. This is why we use interiorities. It's a mouthful, but it's less culturally burdened. And when we see these animals, and this is quite specifically about individual animals, we see them as individuals in the same way that we are individuals. And we have relations with them like we have relations with our kin. Say if you prefer capybaras or peccaries. If we move on to the next one. And then the kind of opposite to this is what De Schola calls naturalism. so in naturalism, like we can say in our kind of Western scientific basis that like us and the capybara are both made of muscles and we have nervous systems. But we would say that we have fundamentally different experiences of the world, which is a kind of Viveros de Castro replies to this and calls it multicultural, because each kind of thing has its own culture, but we exist in the same physicality. And you get some conflicts here when naturalism is kind of put against these other perspectives, such as with the river Wanganui. So this is a river that was given legal personhood after indigenous people fought for higher protections for it. And so you can see a tension there between a kind of scientific account of personhood and an animist perspective and a naturalist perspective. Okay, here we go. Next one. Totemism. Basically, the difference with animism is that for totemists, they would believe that they're descended from specific natural creatures. So the broga here is an Australian bird. The scholar uses Australian examples. I had a whole thing I would have said anyway. But they see that the physicality and the interiority are both similar on a gradient. So rather than having big gaps, so the big gap in animism is between physicalities, and the big gap in naturalism is between interiorities. There's a relationship between the totem that you're born into and your kind of nature, basically. And this isn't very similar to the totem as in Ojibwe culture, where the word comes from, but people don't want to change the words. Okay, next slide. And then analogism is where a lot of cultures that people like come into. And I think that knowing how this works better would help people understand them with a different perspective. But also analogism is really poorly developed within the scholar's system. And so it's a site of debate. And I'm going to explain the picture. You can see that in the image of the man, you have this bucket where his heart or stomach is, and there is a urn for burning stuff, like around the solar plexus area. And so you can see that there is a kind of analogy between how different things in the world work together and how different parts of ourselves work together. And so there is this strong kind of a similar kind of correlation, but whereas we're the same as this thing and we behave similarly, the idea is that the world is made up of a huge number of very different things that all work differently, but as part of a whole. And I'm going to skip the astrology section. And then Salins comes in and he's like, actually, we can just call all of this animism again, because they're all a lot more similar to each other than they are to naturalism. So yeah, I think I've got through it all with 5 minutes for questions. Yeah. Oh, I have questions at the end. Okay.
Questions at the end. Brilliant. Heroic effort, Jake.
Yeah, so read the questions. I don't think I have time to go through them all.
Well, we do have 5 minutes to take questions, though.
5 minutes to take questions, and I just want to make sure we don't forget to share our sources.
We will share all sources. I'm going to
we'll
flash
share our
those
sources at the end,
so people can come back to them. But I also want to recommend that folks like and subscribe both to my new channel, Lands Unknown, but also head over to Let's Have a Bouba and lend a subscription there. Do you have a YouTube channel as well?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Not
I'm
yet,
gonna
at
answer
least.
Sorry. I'm going back and checking the questions. So, yeah, basically on the question of dryads in Kami, I don't know enough about dryads. Like, I think that when I think about the ancient Greeks, I think of analogism because of like this line in Aristotle that's like basically saying that, yeah, humans have souls and dogs have souls, but humans have human souls and dogs have doggy souls. So like there is this idea that like, first of all, that the soul is a kind of separate part of the being, and that each thing is separate to each other, right? Whereas with animism, there's kind of a huge leveling of the playing field. With Kami, it's complicated because like they have been so many different things in so many different stages. The argument that Shinto is a nature religion is, if I'm being very honest, it often feels like post World War II apologism for doing a lot of violence. But like I think that to me it feels, you could argue it's animism, but they aren't really. I think because of the stratification of Kami, like there are so many levels of them, it's probably more like analogism. But that's where these terms are often kind of unhelpful, because analogism is really poorly developed by the scholar, and he says, oh, I could talk about China for this one, but you have to be very erudite to talk about China. And he says, I'm going to talk about Mesoamerica instead. Like, you really are going to admit that you just gave up on studying this Chinese bit, and then you're going to say this about Mesoamerican culture? like very dodgy book, but anyway, yeah. Sorry. With 2 minutes, you two say what you want to say. I'm done.
I'm gonna drop a link into the comments for the next stream in the World Building Festival. It's also available down in the description, as is a link to Jake's channel and the Patreon for Let's Have a Bouba. We also have the link to the entire website for the festival, where you can find the whole schedule and figure out what you'd like to watch. I certainly have 3 more streams. I've got a stream on chariots in 3 hours, which is going to be a great time. I have a stream at 5 a.m. my time tomorrow morning with Biblaridian talking about polities and state development. And then I'm going to be hanging out with Madeline to the wrap up, because while Madeline did organize the whole World Building Festival, apparently I suggested it. So I've also have a link to my Ko-Fi in there. I don't have any memberships or things set up yet, but it would really help support the research I do as an academic, as well as the time that I take to build the content.
Put the sources on. We've got 1 minute.
Don't forget the sources. Boom. All right. This is the first half of our sources listed alphabetically. And there's the second half there. I'll add the sources into the description of the video after we finish going live.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you again at 5 p.m. my time, or in 3 hours. Well, thank you, Bavea. Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Nemo.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Galley Girl. And I also want to thank number 1 top commenter, Amber, from the beginning of the stream, who gave me my 500th subscription before I have a video. That was very important. Thank you, Magpie and Seb.
I think if we
Yeah,
close this, then
everyone.
it switches over to the
Oh,
next
put the
stream
applause
automatically.
noise on. Put the applause noise on.
Oh yeah. Oh no, I don't know where that went.
Oh no.
No. Oh, I found it. I found it. I found it.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Over. Yeah. Bye bye. Thank you all.